very great pleasure and honor to be here. The only difficulty about speaking last on a platform which is likely to go over the edge if I push on it, is that this has been such an exhausting conference from beginning to end, including a dinner up at Sundance last night, that the only betting question is whether or not I'll be able to last the 45 minutes that I've been assigned to talk. As Lisa started to tell you, I have a very heterogeneous background. The thing that she forgot to tell you is that constitutional law, at least as a writing thing, is a relatively small part of my portfolio. But I don't want to dwell on the things that I don't know. What I'd rather do is to try and see if I could set the table to explain what the topic is. And I gather the title is something about liberty and equality. Is that correct? All right, well, thank you. Well, now I know which speech I have to give of the many that I've given over the years in the past. But in order to do that, I think it's probably useful to give you first at least a little expression of what the title of the book is about and why it is that I use the word classical liberal with respect to the book, even though in many other places where I do more popular writing, the term that is often used with my name is the libertarian, which doesn't mean the foremost libertarian. It may mean the only libertarian left standing in the world today, but I don't think it's that. And the difference between the two theories, I think, is really important because the great difficulty of being a traditional libertarian is that you cannot figure out how, from the tools of that theory, you can actually form a collective viable organization known as the state, endowed with monopoly powers over the population that it rules, but subject to limitations that make sure that the monopoly power is not exercised in an inappropriate fashion. Classical liberalism is an effort to try and enrich the theory, make things a little bit more complicated, but answer that particular question. So to go back to the libertarian theory, the basic norms associated with that particular theory are relatively few, and they're all quite powerful. One of them, of course, is that in coming to any kind of social organization, there is always the question as to who owns each individual person. The good libertarian comes up with the principle of individual autonomy so that each person is, in fact, in control of his or her body and his or her mental faculties and his or her talents. To some people, this might seem to be a perfectly self-evident proposition, but in modern political theory, particularly the theory associated with a man named John Rawls, the question of whether or not people have individual ownership of talents has in fact been contested. The reason I think one rejects that is if each person does not own his or her own talents, the question of how the joint ownership rights are to be defined and to be given to a whole variety of other people creates such a quagmire and nightmare that it is simply not a stable place from which you can begin to deal with other rights. Now, once you have these autonomy rights, the question is, what is it that you can do with them? And essentially, doing with your autonomy rights gets you to move in two particular directions. One is that it turns out by virtue of the fact that you own your own labor, you're generally entitled to sell it in the marketplace on whatever terms and conditions you see fit. And in addition to having control with respect to economic transactions, it's equally important to remember that by virtue of this kind of self-ownership, it's what explains such mundane things as the right to marry, the right to pray in accordance with the faith that you have, the right to form voluntary associations for nonprofit purposes, a whole variety of range of activities that you could not do if you were owned by others, but which you can do quite effectively if, in fact, self-ownership is the implicit norm by which your behaviors are going to be regulated. So what happens is the autonomy norm explains a huge portion of the way in which we look at a legal system. And it's not just simply a matter of intuition. This microphone's going crazy. Not just simply a matter of intuition. What you always have to ask yourself is if you don't like that rule, what rule do you put into its place? And the complexities that come from any alternative rule are so formidable that in the end, every legal system, regardless of its ostensible differences, always begins with an autonomy norm with respect to persons. Now, the second question is, if you can use your labor in order to advance yourself through voluntary transactions, is there any other way in which you could use it? And the classical answer to that question has always been that you can use it to acquire property. And the method by which property has been acquired is essentially to take it. If something is unowned, the first person to capture it is generally treated as its owner. This is sometimes thought to be egotistical and selfish, But in fact, this is probably a misapprehension of the way in which this particular rule works. The first point to note about it is one of its great strengths is it means that property no longer comes from the state, but it comes from the private action of autonomous individuals, so that the claim for state power is not something which is to be presumed, it's something to be demonstrated. It has to be something that the individuals who own their own liberty and their own property put together over themselves to improve their general well-being. In addition, it turns out that the ability to acquire property by possession is something which is shared amongst all individuals, so it's very unlikely that any single person can gobble up all the land in the world. Other people are out there doing the kind of competition. And the third limitation, which is vitally important, is there are many kinds of resources which are left in the common by design, mainly water and air, because if you try to reduce them to private ownership, these systems would essentially destroy. And so the traditional common law rules with respect to acquisition understood that these regimes to which everybody has access but nobody has ownership are in fact a part and parcel of the overall system. Now, the key feature of having a system of property is that it means that resources once acquired turn out now to have an owner who can figure out what it is to do with them. And so the usual rule is, under the standard libertarian theory, is that as an owner you could exclude others, as an owner you can enter the property, as an owner you can use the property, as an owner you can develop the property, as an owner you can dispose of the property to other individuals. And if you put this ball of wax together in that particular form, it means that having gotten land and other resources into play through a simple ownership rule, cooperative ventures will allow you in a great many situations to form businesses, corporations, and other kinds of arrangements which allow people to pool their talents. How do these things take place? Well, essentially they take place through contract. And so the third great feature of a standard libertarian theory is one which says I can trade with you, you can trade with me, anybody can trade with anybody else. And the theory is if the rest of the world is kept at bay, then you, by entering into these special arrangements, can improve the lot of the two people to it, and then as if by an individual hand, if you've got good transactions going on between A and B, everybody else is going to benefit because the wealth in the society has increased and other people could become better off. If D, E, and F do the same thing, exactly the same kind of consequences go, so that within the standard theory, one of the key functions of the law is to lower the frictions associated with getting these transactions together in order to increase the overall size of the pond. And the last piece of the standard libertarian theory is that you can't bypass any of these rules. So the prohibition against theft means that the person who takes the land is the person who's allowed to keep it. And it also turns out that if I wish to enter into a voluntary arrangement with somebody else, no third person can come along either by the use of force or by the use of false words in order to deter and to upset that situation. So essentially what happens is individual rights and autonomy set the ball for what you can do. Property then extends it into the external world. Gains from trade are allowed through contract, and the law of tort makes sure that the first three set of rules that we're talking about are kept into place. Now, this is a very powerful theory, and when you start to teach private law subjects like contracts and torts and so forth, keeping these elements in mind is usually quite sufficient to get you a very powerful explanation of the way in which certain kinds of transactions take place. But the central lesson of political theory is that these rules are not sufficient to create a society, and there are other problems that you have to deal with. And the problems that you're talking about are as follows. Sometimes when you deal with non-cooperative behavior, it turns out that individuals can do things in ways that fit these particular rules, but still result in major harms. So if you go back to the rule of acquisition that I talked about, its great virtue is that what it does is it allows you to get a single owner to figure out how to deal with a particular asset. But if you're not very careful, this same rule will encourage overfishing, overhunting, and lead to the massive extinction of a large number of kinds of animals. If you look to certain kinds of property rights, like those in oil and gas, since these are spread over the entire globe or over very large portions, over-drilling could do exactly the same kind of thing. If you let people get together by contract, sometimes they'll get together by contracts in restraint of trade, and so what you will do is create various kinds of voluntary monopolies. And then, most importantly, if it turns out that you need to create public facilities, there is no way that you can do this all the time by voluntary arrangements. There's a classic problem known as the freeloader. This is the guy who says, you guys can form the state and protect me, but don't ask me to contribute anything to its defense. And there's the further problem which says, in order to run this state, what we have to do is to develop public roads. Sometimes we need public parks, we need public buildings, we need public forts. And you can't run a world in which every individual can hold out against the collection of assets for common use, because in effect, you can have a situation where you assemble 8 of the 9 plots you need for a fort, and the other guy says, I'm going to charge you a bloody fortune to finish it. So what you have to do is to overcome the holdout problem as well as the coordination problem, which exists if you take the libertarian principles, wise as they are, one step too far. And so the question then is, what kind of institutions do you have to put into place to deal with these problems? And the answer is essentially 2. One, you must develop a regime of taxation, which libertarians of the hard school variety find it very difficult to organize, and you must develop a regime of eminent domain, which allows the government to take certain pieces of private property upon payment of just compensation and to put them into a system of public use. And if you could accomplish those 2 things, then by use of the taxes, what you can do is now provide the resources for the creation and defense of public order, and by the eminent domain power, you could prevent individual holdouts from wrecking what is a perfectly sensible common plan, but making sure that they're not left worse off than they would otherwise be by supplying them with just compensation for the property that you take. So classical liberalism, in opposition to the standard libertarian theory, is a theory which essentially allows for this kind of coercion to take place by government. So what you're doing, in effect, is you're arming governments, which are always dangerous, with a set of powers that they can use in very dangerous fashion. And then the question is how you limit them. And this then starts to get us to the major features of a constitution. As we talked about in the title of this paper, I gather this is the title of my talk, we're trying to talk about the classical liberal constitution, and we're trying to talk about the way in which it relates to the intersection between liberty on the one hand and property on the other. And that requires that you develop a set of stable institutions which allow the 2 things to merge together into a coherent whole. So you have to figure out exactly what these institutions are going to be. And so it's not enough simply to say that you have tax revenues to run a state or that you could overcome holdout problems. It's also absolutely critical to figure out how you design the public institutions of government so as to be consistent with the formation of the various kinds of institutions that you want. The way in which this problem was crystallized most clearly was back in the Federalist paper, and the Federalist paper I'm talking about here was one written by James Madison, the year about 1787, 1788, and the question was what you do with the so-called problem of faction, which is the major problem of political theory. What happens is, if in fact you put a governance structure together, somebody is going to have the power to coerce other individuals to pay these taxes. Somebody is going to have all sorts of coercive powers with respect to the enforcement and the administration of the criminal and the civil law. How do you make sure that the people who are given the powers to protect your liberties do not act in such a way that they become the greatest danger to the liberties that you've ever had? And this is not an idle situation. If you look around very generally to the history of Western civilization, the most somber lesson that you discover from it is that most efforts to form an orderly government have failed. That the politics of special interest arrangements, the use of force, the unprincipled application of governance power and so forth has ripped society to their part. And so this was the issue for which the framers, I think, tried to develop a relatively systematic constitutional design, and that they were able to do this in a way which, in fact, reflects, I think, its great strength. So what I'm going to do is to start to tell you some of the ways in which this system was put together, and then start to tell you what I think was the major threat to this particular system by the formation and the creation of the progressive movement, which started to arise in the United States about 1900 and reached its common law peak, or its constitutional peak, in 1936-37 with the great transformation that existed in the Supreme Court. And well, the first thing that one has to do is to recognize that whenever you're dealing with a system of government powers, they could be used for good or for evil. And so the purpose of a constitutional design is to allow as much of the good stuff to go forward as is possible, and to keep as much of the bad stuff from going forward as is possible as well. So let's just start looking at the two kinds of powers that we've talked to, and this will give you, I think, some hint as to why it is that structural elements in a constitution matter enormously if the question that you're trying to answer is, how do you keep Leviathan tethered to the point where it doesn't become a very great menace to the liberties and properties that it's supposed to protect? That becomes the fundamental dilemma. And so at this particular point, it's very useful to contrast the Articles of Confederation on a couple of points with, in fact, the Constitution as it was devised. And the point on which is most particular is that under the Articles of Confederation, you had a loose affiliation of states, but there was no central government which had the power to tax individuals so as to raise the monies that were necessary to make sure that a government from the center could actually operate. And one of the first things that the founders of the Constitution did was to realize that a central government that had to beg for money from individual states would never be strong and viable in its operation. And so what they did is they gave the government a power in order to tax. But this was not an untrammeled power. It was a power which was defined as follows. It says that the government has the power to tax, and it can tax in order to pay off the debt, by which they meant the public debt, much of which was incurred, for example, in the early days to pay off the revolutionary debt. It was the power to pay money for the common defense, and it was the power to essentially tax in order to support the general welfare of the United States. And the question is exactly how do these particular terms work, and what is it that they're supposed to mean? Well, the first strategy that you see with respect to these terms is that there's a very conscious effort to try to limit the ends to which public monies are to be spent. And if you start looking at the public debt, well, clearly, if you wish to have public infrastructure and public improvements of any sort, there is no way in which that can be done if, in fact, you cannot finance things with borrowed money. Think of the situation with respect to your own house. People don't have ready cash to build it. When you start thinking about the creation of public infrastructure, it's exactly the same problem. You have to put the thing in together today, and you're going to pay it off by the kinds of revenues or other public benefits that you get tomorrow. And so having a borrowing market becomes absolutely essential, and the Constitution says that when you tax, you can use it, obviously, to repay and to fund the debt. When it comes to the common defense, this is essentially a device which is to make sure that the United States can deal with attacks to its bodily integrity from invasions from without and also from all sorts of internal disruptions within. It is not widely appreciated today because the issue is no longer with us after the Civil War. But when they formed the Constitution, one of the major challenges they had to face was to figure out how it was that they were to prevent or to control states from going to war with one another. So the federal government essentially had two functions. One, it had to keep things at peace with respect to the rest of the world. And secondly, what it had to do was to develop various kinds of mechanisms to do it inside. Again, unless you can do this by taxation, it will never succeed because voluntary contributions will always fall short by virtue of the fact that some people will try to freeload on the good intentions of others in the way in which these put these things together. The last of these three particular heads is in many ways the most important for future development because nobody argues over what the first two heads are about, but the third head starts to talk about the general welfare of the United States. And one of the interesting things about it is if you go back very much to early times, including Hamilton writing about this in his report on manufactures, what everybody does is they sort of drop out some of the words. In basically, ink is too expensive, so you start talking about this as the general welfare clause, and you drop the words of the United States, as if it doesn't make any difference. But in fact, it makes a huge difference, and let me see if I could explain to you what this is about. If you're trying to figure out what the analogy is to a government, it is never a simple contract between two parties. The closest analogies that you have to government are various kinds of corporate arrangements which have remarkable similarities to the kinds of political arrangements you're talking about here, or arrangements for voluntary associations. You have to have somebody with executive authority. You call them a CEO in business. You call them the president in the United States. It turns out that you have to have a governing policy to set and implement policy. You could call it a board of trustees if you're dealing with respect to corporations. Call it the Congress of the United States if you're dealing with our Constitution, right? And then if you're talking about a corporations, you have shareholders. If you're talking about the United States, you have citizens and taxpayers. And the question is always how it is that you keep the arrangements amongst the three together. And so to understand what the general welfare of the United States is about, it becomes absolutely critical to understand the way in which corporate powers can be used in the private sector. And essentially, this is the basic distinction that one draws in the corporate law. When you say that the officers and directors of a corporation must do something for the benefit of the corporation, what you're intending to talk about are what are called technically Pareto improvements. Now, that's a word to drive the rest of you out of the audience, so I'll explain to you what it means. Essentially, what you're saying is a well-functioning corporation will only take those cents which will improve the lot of all citizens if it's going to improve the lot of any given citizen. The shares are held pro rata, and what you're trying to do is to make sure that the improvement that you make by investment or various other kinds of employment strategies work pretty much across the board. The one thing that blows a corporation apart are efforts by the Board of Trustees to allow for transfer payments to take place between various members of the corporation. So if in fact what the corporation can do is have a Board of Trustees which says we're going to take money from everybody whose name begins with A through K and give it to people whose names begin with L through Z, what you do is you no longer have a corporation. What you do is you have a system of built-in factions between the two halves. And the more freedom that you have in order to make these transfer payments, the less likely it is that you could get anybody to invest. Indeed, even if you don't know whether it's going to be A through L or A through K are going to be paying L through Z or the other way around, both groups will want to stay out because the uncertainty associated with the instability of capital reduces the value of all investment and therefore essentially undermines the operation of the system as we know it. So you cannot do that. And so what corporations do is they develop very powerful rules against this kind of self-dealing, and they use a much more lax business judgment rule with respect to the way in which the corporation enters into business trustees transactions on an honest basis with third parties, knowing that you can't tag the corporation with the loss if you hope these guys to stay in business. So you have that dichotomy. Exactly the same problem takes place within the political space. And when they were talking about the general welfare of the United States, what they really meant under this was that you cannot allow a system of transfer payments to be executed by the federal government in which the taxes that come from some citizens are going to be used to basically line the pockets of other citizens. The interesting feature about this view is it was generally widely accepted up through about 1900, and there were all sorts of special programs that were vetoed by people like President Grover Cleveland in the 1880s and early 1890s on the ground that they were illicit transfer programs which would open you up to the danger of faction. And this becomes, of course, an extremely important complication associated with the operation of government. At this particular point in time, the question is, how did this system start to unravel? Because if you wish to figure out what the most powerful set of forces are in the United States today, it is without question the rise of transfer payments which are orchestrated by the federal government for a wide range of programs, of which the two most conspicuous are Medicaid and Medicare on the one hand and Social Security on the other, but which are joined by a whole host of other programs of smaller amounts. These programs have such massive sums. What they do is they now galvanize large numbers of individuals to secure transfers for themselves while making payments upon the other. This changes the tax structure. It makes it more progressive generally. It introduces a multiplicity of special taxes. And what happens is, in an effort to secure the transfer payments for some, you completely undermine the effectiveness of the stability of possession and ownership, which is the ideal of the classical liberal constitution. Now, the way in which this thing got passed is most extraordinary because it doesn't have to do as such with the transfer payments itself. It started with, in effect, the doctrines of standing. And let me explain to a lay audience what this particular means. The original transfer program that one had to do was the Maternity Act, which was passed in around 1920, which was designed to take federal expenditures and to use them to help give assistance to mothers either during pregnancy or shortly after childbirth. And let's assume, for the sake of argument, people think that this is an important thing for people to do. What happens is there are two challenges that are made to this statute. One is made by the state of Massachusetts, and one is made by one of its aristocratic citizens, a woman named Mrs. Frothingham. And what they say is, look at this clause about the spending power, and you cannot use it for transfer payments. You can only use it in order to support bona fide public goods. And what the Supreme Court does is not answer the particular question at all. What it says is, you're just one of many, many taxpayers. You're one of many states. You do not have standing to challenge because you cannot show that you suffered a special injury above and beyond that which has been suffered by everybody else who's been associated with the situation. And so since you are not somebody who has a special injury, you cannot challenge the program in question. The issue then comes up, can anybody challenge this particular program? And in the case of a spending program, the answer to that question is, if you're just taking money out of the public treasury and sending it off to private parties, nobody is going to be in a position to challenge it. So if you did believe, as the United States has long believed, in a principle of judicial supremacy, that is, the United States Supreme Court, since Marbury and Madison, has the power to strike down laws that have been passed by Congress, the standing doctrine amounts to a partial repeal of that particular rule. Because it says whatever the substantive law on this thing is, you know that in practice that there's nobody in a position to put this into place. Now, it turns out that this is a complete misreading of the Constitution, and it's one that is completely inconsistent with the originalist view of the Constitution, which says, try to figure out what the text means so you could coordinate it, and it has to do with something that I think has been mentioned earlier, which is you can't do modern constitutional law unless you can do earlier private law. And in this case, what the Constitution says is the judicial power shall extend to all cases in law and equity. Now, to most people in the room, this doesn't mean very much, but the words "and equity" were designed to show that the Supreme Court had the power in a variety of cases to entertain lawsuits which involve suits by a single shareholder, remember we talked about that before, which was designed to block transfers by a corporate board which were beyond the power of the corporation to make. And the clear analogy is if you can stop private parties from doing that and you have standing, you could do the same thing with respect to the United States. And when the Supreme Court says you have to show a discrete industry, that is true with respect to people who are suing for the fact that they've been run over by a bus, but it has always been manifestly false with respect to the way in which you deal with illegal actions, not only in corporations, but also in municipal governments, also in states, and also in England, to the extent that they had any form of limitation. So basically what the United States Supreme Court does is it signs off on this particular venture. And once the transfer payments start to get started, it's very difficult to undo them. Now, the next thing is we come a few years later to talk about the taxing power. And at this particular point, it's the New Deal, which is an issue. And the New Deal essentially has been organized by a system of progressive thought, which is utterly inconsistent with everything that I've talked about with respect to the way in which the original Constitution was designed. It is a genuine intellectual revolution, and it is, I believe, one that was for the worse, which is why it is I ended up writing this long book to expose what I could about the political and substantive failures of the regime. And the basic impulse for the progressive movement in the United States comes from a large number of sources, of which, for example, Woodrow Wilson, who was at one time the president of Princeton, one time the governor of New Jersey, and one time the president of the United States, was perhaps the foremost academic champion writing about congressional government in 1885 when he was 29 years old. And the basic principle that he took is we are now going into a brave new age. And in this brave new age, what we have to understand is that market institutions do not work well when you have large corporations as they do when you have small individuals. And in effect, now that we've run these sciences on the model of the great German research university, places like not coincidentally Princeton. We now have enough knowledge at the center that we can get a set of impartial bureaucrats who will displace the chaotic functions of market institutions with learned and well-conceived public programs. And if you looked at the original Constitution, as far as Wilson was concerned, it was, quote unquote, a grievous mistake because all of its devices were built on exactly the opposite presumption. The system of separation of power, the system of judicial review, the protection of private rights of property, and so forth, were all designed to slow down this massive administrative process. And if, in fact, you're a good progressive, what you have to do is to figure out how it is that you could flip these things over so that large centralized powers could make comprehensive judgments for the betterment and the welfare of the United States. I hasten to say when I talk about the progressives, they were, in effect, regarded themselves as members of the New Enlightenment. They thought, in effect, that the level of growth that you could have in the United States and the level of equality that you could achieve in the United States would be far greater if they were put into charge than if you kept with these fossilized rules which simply could not apply in the new age. And so it was those people who started to do this. And by the 1930s, there were a whole variety of devices that were put into place in order to achieve this. And the first of these tended to involve the use of taxing power. And so one of the things that the United States government decided to do was to impose various kinds of taxes on agricultural produce. And then if it turned out that you were a good fellow and you destroyed some of your crops so as to keep the prices high, cartels were a big business under the New Deal, what would happen is you'd get a rebate. And the issue is whether or not these kinds of taxing and spending schemes would be permissible. At the first run of this, the answer was, no, you really can't do it, shame on you. But the willingness of the, quote, old court to stand up to the new realities was very uncertain. And by the time you get to great decisions, i.e. in terms of their importance, not their soundness, by people like Justice Benjamin Nathan Cardozo, a towering figure at the time, essentially the tax power got turned on its head. The words of the United States get forgotten, and we are now told that the only thing that limits the scope of the taxing power of the United States is the ability of Congress to do things in any other form. And so therefore, as the congressional power expands, taxing power expands with it. Now, this phrase, what can the Congress do otherwise, in fact, then gets us to the second element of the New Deal revolution, which again has to do with the relationship of liberty and equality, albeit in an indirect way. If one goes back to the jurisdictional powers of the Constitution, essentially in Article 1, Section 8, the Constitution embodies a theory known as the theory of enumerated powers. And what that means is, since we are so worried about the ability of factions to control the government, the way in which we wish to stop that is to make sure that the number of tasks that the government can take is reduced. And if we reduce the number of tasks that they can undertake, you reduce the opportunity and the maneuvering room for shenanigans. The most expansive power that one had at that time was called the Commerce Power. And it read, Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations among the several states and with the Indian tribes. And it's that middle clause that got all the attention. If you go back to John Marshall, who thought he gave it an expansive interpretation in a case called Gibbons and Ogden in 1824, essentially what the Commerce Power covered was the ability to transmit goods and people, communication and transportation across state lines. And the theory was that Congress would basically form the basis of an economic common union by keeping the areas of commerce open amongst the various states. It didn't quite work out that way, but essentially what it did mean on the negative side was that the government could not, in effect, regulate domestic manufacture, transportation that took place solely within a state, say a bus company inside a particular city, mining and agriculture. It meant, most importantly, in the antebellum years before the Civil War, that Congress could not abolish slavery within the states, which is one of the reasons why this theory, in fact, was done. Slavery is the least libertarian institution you could possibly imagine, but oddly enough, it had a pervasive influence on the way in which particular constitutional structures were put, including those having to do with the federal power under the Commerce Clause. So now, if you may go back to what I said, if you can't regulate it through the Commerce Power, then you can't regulate it through the tax power, just as if you can regulate it through the Commerce Power, you can regulate it through the tax power. So long as you kept a narrow vision of what the Constitution did with respect to the power of government to give direct regulation, you had a narrow vision of the taxing power. And so this situation essentially got upended in the period between 1937 and 1941. And this is all highly technical and may put you to sleep, but it's in these technical doctrines that the life and death of a country survives or does not survive. So going back to 1918, there's a case called Hammer and Degenhardt. And what this particular case has to do with the progressive movement to try to find a federal way to impose child labor laws on the various states in manufacturing. And the device that they settled on was ingenuity itself. It said, if you wish to ship your goods in interstate commerce, what we will do is we will ban them if they are made in factories that have used child labor under the age of 14. And in North Carolina, the age limit was 12. And so if, in fact, you could keep this law in place, everybody who wants to sell to the interstate market will have to trade off between the relatively modest inconvenience of getting rid of young child labor with the catastrophic loss of going into interstate commerce. And what the Supreme Court said in a 5-4 decision, yes, we know you're regulating commerce, but we know that this effort to use your government monopoly power is what the economists call leverage, trying to regulate domestic issues by controlling these kinds of foreign issues. And so what then happens is it strikes it down. Congress never rests because, remember, factions never cease to move. So what they try to do is not basically impose a prohibition, but to impose a tax on goods that are made in factories that use child labor. And the Supreme Court in 1922 in the child labor cases strikes that down as well. So if you get to 1937, you could see what happens. If the commerce power is very narrow, then it turns out that the taxing power is very narrow. But by 1937, all the old limitations on the power of Congress to regulate commerce are completely upended. No longer is it just a matter of how it is that we do this with respect to goods being shipped back and forth in interstate commerce or passenger trade in interstate commerce. Now manufacture and mining and agriculture all come under the definition of contract on the government, on the theory that in an integrated national economy, you have to have one party who can regulate everybody. Now, this turns out to be intellectually, I think, a terrible mistake. Let me see if I can explain to you why. What happens is whenever you expand the power of government to do anything, it expands its ability to do good things, and it expands its ability to do bad things. And so the question you're asking about it is, what is it that the federal government is doing with its new power over manufacture and agriculture that is a good thing relative to the bad things that it could be doing? Well, there's no question that there's going to be a lot of internal demand within the states for various kinds of law that deal, for example, with difficult safety issues. And workmen's compensation statutes, for example, in the first part of the 20th century were introduced pretty consistently across the country. And you could do that state by state, because if the statute makes sense for your state, you're not worried about other states who don't follow. Hey, you've done the right thing. If they don't want to follow, you get a better advantage. And if you do the right thing and they do the right thing, at least you've been able to keep up. So what is characteristic about the progressive era is that it basically institutionalizes one of the mistakes that I talked about at the beginning of this lecture. If you remember, I said freedom of contract is a wonderful device, but if you start using it to form cartels and monopolies, not so good, and you need an antitrust law. But the Federalists, the progressives, were so confident that they knew what was right or wrong. What they did is they institutionalized cartels across all industries. The first step of this actually took place in 1914 under Wilson, where they said, you know, we're going to exempt agricultural cartels and labor cartels from the antitrust law, and we're just going to apply it to business. The kind of constitutional ad hocery which should always set off alarm bells in your mind. But in the 1930s, with both agriculture and with respect to labor, they said, it's not enough to do that. What we have to do is to have the government form the cartels itself. This meant in agriculture, it would set national quotas, and then it would use the Department of Agriculture to allocate it to different states and different counties and different farms. And it meant mandatory collective bargaining in the labor situation where management was forced to deal with monopoly unions. So what happens is virtually every single application of the expanded commerce power is something which is designed to prop up cartels, which are completely destructive. And the other feature that they did at this particular point in time is they got rid of traditional rules on freedom of contract. So the great advantage of freedom of contract in a competitive economy is if somebody starts to behave in a particularly obnoxious fashion, somebody else will come in with an offer to pick that person up. So there's a basic global judgment that the way in which you deal with people who are irresponsible employers or vendors and something else is you either sue them for breach of contract or, more potently, you take your business somewhere else. And it's exactly this mechanism of free entry which explained the enormous level of growth in the period between 1900 and 1935, at the same time that the progressives were saying that industrialization required a new set of rules. It was exactly the opposite. With industrialization, more firms came in, the ability to trade across state lines increased because of improved communication and transportation, and the system actually grew. It's not just a matter of economic growth, it was also a matter of individual health. Life expectancy in 1900 was about 47 across the country. For black individuals, it was about 32. By the time you get to 1935, it's around 62 or 63 years of age, an increase which is unprecedented in the history of mankind, and it's driven by technology and by competition. The progressives never saw any of that. So now let me sum up, because I think we're coming close to the end of the time. Is that right, Rick? What happens is you can now see what happens to the classical liberal constitution. Originally, what it does is it's designed to give government enough power so as to maintain order. It gives it the power to raise taxes, preferably fat taxes. It gives the power to regulate monopolies, which the classical liberal judges always were prepared to do in connection with the antitrust laws and so forth. It gives you the power to secure property rights. It gives you the power to control the waste and dissipation of common pool assets, all of which was done in the period between 1865 and 1900. It gives you the power actually to control sensibly railroads, which are a very complicated kind of negative a network industry, which was done in effect around 1887 and so forth. And it doesn't give you too much extra. The moment you go to the bigger stuff on taxation and the bigger stuff with respect to regulation and the unquestioned power of the government to block ordinary labor contracts and other contracts for sale, all of a sudden it's the negative elements of government that predominate. This started in 1937. It did have a negative effect. It certainly prolonged the recession/depression through the beginning of the Second World War. In the years that followed, I think we can say that the United States grew, but less than it ought to have done because of these things. But the political constitution still was influenced by the old classical liberal tradition, and people examined most forms of government regulation under a modest, weak, but important presumption against government intervention. If you will note, in the last 5 or 6 years, the term progressive has now come back into vogue. And that's because these people regard the model of good government as the New Deal of 1935, when they were churning out cartels at a record base. And if you want to explain why it is that the current system has gone off the rails, it's because the progressive vision now not only has constitutional leeway to be implemented, but it has enough political support so as to go into place. So you see uncertainty in taxes, you see increases in level of progressivity, you see an effort to punish any business that wants to leave the United States because the tax structures are too high. That's a signal you're doing something wrong. You see comprehensive legislation of labor markets to a level that has never happened. You see really powerful, and I think in many cases indefensible, enforcements of the anti-discrimination laws. You start seeing the antitrust laws being used to prop up monopolies instead of to knock them down. So essentially, the progressive vision of strong government transfer payments on top of a heavily regulated economy is what has taken the order of the day. And what's the lesson you learn from this? If you reduce the productive base by putting these regulations in place, you cannot support the transfer economy that you wish to have on top of it. So the kind of performance we've had in the United States since, say, about 2008, arguably even since Bill Clinton, is a reflection of the fact that the progressive vision, which had won constitutionally, now seems to have won politically. And the purposes of my 2 books is to try and mount the intellectual campaign in a non-political setting to see if one can reverse the intellectual climate so as to undo what I regard as systematic mistakes. These are not simply marginal errors. They're not calculation errors. They're fundamental errors of political structure. And in the progressive tradition, all of them, whether you're dealing with standing, taxation, commerce power, or individual rights. They've got everything precisely backwards. Thank you.